right, good morning, everyone. I think it's 8:40 and we have such a short time frame. I want to make sure we get started because we have a lot to cover. Welcome. Nice to see so many people here to hear about uplifting subjects such as water and SGMA. And so there's a great panel here today that you're going to hear some great information. We like to say in our business that SGMA is a journey that everyone's in a different spot on. And so don't worry how much or how little you know about SGMA. You're going to learn a lot today. So welcome. You are in the Water Supply Challenges and Solutions for 2022 Outlook. I'm Sarah Wolf. I have a company called WaterWise. I work with primarily farmers and a lot of new and small water districts that are making their way through the SGMA process. And we have a great panel that is going to be able to touch on all the different aspects of SGMA. We're going to get a great overview from Dave Orth, who's with New Current, and he has a depth of knowledge in water, both surface and groundwater supplies, and electricity. There's many resource discussions Dave could have, but he's going to give an overview, a little bit of SGMA and what he's seen out in the marketplace or in the industry so far. And then we have Paul Goslin with Department of Water Resources. He's the Deputy Director of SGMA, so he is the individual that is overseeing the reviews of the groundwater sustainability plans, and he's going to give you the perspective of Department of Water Resources, which will be wonderful. And then we have Scott Hamilton with Hamilton Economic Resources. That Scott has so much knowledge on water in California. Somebody said to me last night, he's the premier expert on Delta Smelt, and I've sat in a number of court hearings with him on Delta Smelt where we both are looking at each other saying our lives are changing, and they have over the years. And Scott's going to give us some updates on projects and opportunities in the valley to deal with SGMA and increase our water supplies, hopefully. And finally, we have Jesse Roseman from the Almond Board, and he has been with the Almond Board since 2016, and he's going to give us an overview of the new report that's just come out that the Almond Board did on, I hate to say it, but deficit irrigation for almonds, and some tools that the Almond Board has provided you. So I'm not going to take much of the time because the substance is really going to come from our panelists, so I'm going to let Dave Orth get us going.
Thank you, Sarah, and I guess somebody's going to load up our slides here in a moment. Or maybe I just do that. That'll work. Perfect. So good morning, everybody. I'm going to give you a real quick run-through of some basic structures of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We're going to use a lot of acronyms, SGMA for that, and then show you some information that we've developed in coordination with the Almond Board and Land IQ. But let me just start with noting that 7 years ago we passed the act, or the state legislature passed the act. As Sarah said, we're clearly on a journey. We're getting to significant milestones, but I think it's pretty clear that 7 years later, most everybody knows about this thing SGMA. But based on some reactions that we saw at some local GSA meetings this week in the San Joaquin Valley, not everybody understands, and hopefully we can help you with some of that understanding. Just a quick overview, subbasins that are identified as medium or high priority by the California Department of Water Resources are required to organize and create a groundwater sustainability plan, or a GSP. It is a very broad-reaching act in scope, covering most of the San Joaquin and Sacramento Valley and large chunks of the Central Coast, some smaller basins in the south. These plans have to define a pathway to sustainable use of groundwater. That pathway has to have projects and management actions in it, and that pathway has to have interim milestones with measurable objectives and minimum thresholds, places that you agree as a local manager that you will not exceed in the management of your groundwater. And it's critically important that coordination amongst GSAs within subbasins be addressed, and it's mandatory, so that we can't have situations where one GSA in a subbasin is at odds with another, and I think that's proving to be a bit of a challenge. So just real quickly here, this map shows you if you're in an orange or a yellow area, you're subject to SGMA. You've got a local agency that's developing a groundwater sustainability plan. There are 515 total groundwater, 515 groundwater basins in the state. About 94 are subject to SGMA and are in the process of preparing and implementing groundwater plans. Within those 94 subbasins, we have 260 groundwater sustainability agencies formed. So if you just do the math, you understand the critical importance of coordination. This, again, if we look at the two bottom bullet points here, about 7 million acres of critically overdrafted groundwater subbasins in the San Joaquin Valley, currently overdrafting somewhere about 1.8 to 2.4 million acre foot per year. That's the number that has to be zeroed out within the timeframes of SGMA. So, as I mentioned, we did some work with the Almond Board and Land IQ a couple of years ago where we tried to identify the footprint of California almonds. And we identified about 850,000 acres in the San Joaquin Valley, 100,000 of which are in white areas. White areas mean you are solely dependent upon groundwater. You don't have surface water. Within those 850,000 acres, there are 13 groundwater subbasins, 95 GSAs. It's quite the task to keep an eye on what your GSAs are doing, and 36 groundwater sustainability plans. A little bit smaller footprint in the Sacramento Valley in 2020, about 180,000 acres, but over 100,000 of which are, again, in these white areas that are totally dependent upon groundwater. So where are we now? There were 21 critically overdrafted subbasins that had to file their GSPs with DWR on or before January 31st of, actually I say 2022, it was 2020. And DWR has until the end of next month to finish that, to complete those review. As of today, I just heard from Paul, as of today, they have found 6 of those plans to be adequate, and they've identified 6 others and given preliminary notices of deficiencies to start a dialogue of the things that need to be fixed before those plans can be found adequate and compliant with the Act. The balance of the GSPs for the rest of the high and medium priority subbasins have to be submitted to DWR by the end of next month as well. And we've spent a lot of time and a lot of GSA meetings kind of monitoring the discussions, summarizing them for our clients, and kind of anticipating what those plans are going to look like. And then DWR, again, with this second round of GSPs, has 2 years to review. I think it's critically important, and I think this is kind of the test, is that DWR needs to see within these plans a pathway to sustainable use of groundwater within 20 years of plan adoption. And you have to tell your story. I mean, you have to explain as a GSA how you reached the conclusions that are in your plan and how you're going to progress to that sustainable objective within the allowed time frame. It's also important to know that these plans, you don't file them like we used to do groundwater management plans. We'd create one and then we'd file it and we'd do a little bit of work. Well, now we have to do a mandatory 5-year updates and explain where the agencies are at in the implementation of their GSP. So some emerging issues here I want to just kind of stress for a moment is it's obvious to us that the current drought has accelerated the impacts and implementation of the management actions in a lot of GSAs. One good example is the Cahuilla Subbasin, where the 3 GSAs, I think their GSP says, we're going to think about pumping restriction, allocation of groundwater credits, and pumping restriction within the first 5 years of our plan adoption. All 3 of those GSAs are currently talking about, and I think one of them has already established an allocation program to start retroactively to October 2021 to deal with the impacts that the drought is creating on their local groundwater conditions. As a result, we're seeing more and more an accelerated discussion of allocation and ramp down schedules to a sustainable yield number that As a general rule of thumb, in the southern San Joaquin Valley, half an acre foot per acre is your long-term sustainable yield. As you move north, closer to Stockton, Sacramento, and then north of Sacramento, the numbers get a little bit bigger, acre foot and a half, maybe generously in some areas 2 acre foot per acre. But I don't have to tell you it's hard to grow almonds with half an acre foot per acre. And that's a lot of what the ramp down discussions have tried to address, is how do we sustain ag in the midst of all this. It's pretty clear that protection of drinking water, particularly in the shallow domestic wells and the disadvantaged communities, is a high priority to the state administration, and we've seen a lot of discussion about how these plans are not protective. Subsidence along the Frank-Kern Canal down in Tulare County, out on the California Aqueduct and the Westlands Water District are key factors that are gaining a lot of attention. We also have a big question ultimately is how much water is there really available to recharge? Because if we don't have water to recharge, then the only way we solve the sustainability question is through pumping restrictions. SGMA was passed with the assumption that there would be more water, that we'd continue to develop backbone infrastructure to allow us to increase storage, increase conveyance, and offset the reduction of groundwater use. I would argue that we're way behind that objective. A couple other things here. I'll just quickly address a lot of groundwater trading conversations going on in agencies where they have to first allocate groundwater. They're now trying to figure out how do we allow trades and how do we control those trades so that they, as they are executed, they don't create undesirable results against the sustainability objective. And then this point of land repurposing, which I know Paul's going to talk about a little bit in his presentation. Estimates are that we will see somewhere around 500,000 to 750,000 acres of land repurposed. That's the new buzzword for retired or fallowed as a result of implementing some of these actions. Most of that's going to be in the southern San Joaquin Valley, just because of water supply conditions. And so we've started talking about ways to manage that repurposing of property to create other multiple benefits. So again, Paul may discuss this a little bit, but as DWR reviews these plans, they have 3 basic options under the statute. They can approve a plan, and as I've mentioned, they've approved 6. They can find the plan incomplete and give the GSA a time period to correct those deficiencies, or they can just find that the plan isn't compliant with SGMA. Inadequate plans are referred to the State Water Resources Control Board, which is the regulatory agency that permits and licenses surface water and now has the authority under SGMA to be the interim groundwater sustainability agency and establish a plan until the local agencies get a SGMA compliant plan in place. That's not a good option for anybody. We don't want the state board to manage our local groundwater supplies. They've already said and established a significant fee structure, a condition of individual reporting of how much groundwater you use annually, and they've stated that they're not going to be real creative here. They're going to start looking at rapid paths to sustainable yield, pumping of the sustainable yield numbers. So again, critically important that we succeed at the local level and do our best to keep the state board out of our local business. So just my final slide here is to just note some key implementation objectives that we continue to work with the GSAs and the local agencies and our client base to try to attain. And one is we want to continue to support local management of groundwater for the points I just made. Local agencies have been doing this a long time. They're well positioned. We also need to recognize that there's a lot of data gap out there, and the more data gaps that exist, the less refined we are relative to some of the long-term estimates. We need to do everything we can to capture every acre foot of groundwater or surface water that isn't being beneficially used today and get it into recharge and eliminate barriers at the regulatory level, at the legal level, to allow these agencies to maximize the management of their surface water. We need to remember that we have 20 years to achieve this, that we don't need to fix this broken mousetrap today. We need to look at this 20-year timeline. And then, as I mentioned earlier, really focus on continued investment in backbone infrastructure and start getting creative about managing how this land use conversion is going to occur. So with that, I'm going to skip that last slide because I think it'll come up in Q&A, and we'll pass the hat to Paul. Thank you.
Dave did an excellent job staying on task. I just want to say real quickly before Paul gets up, Paul has a very difficult task, and I was just recently on a call where we were discussing deficiencies of a subbasin. DWR is really, really working to find solutions locally of how we can get through this process. So I think it will be very imperative to listen to Paul's comments and how we can work in our own subbasins to meet the requirements of the Act. And I thank Paul for coming to speak to us.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Goslin. I'm Deputy Director for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office at DWR. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. Talk about SGMA. And I do want to really thank the Almond Board, growers, and people locally who've been real leaders in assisting to implement SGMA. The challenges are enormous, but so I'll talk about the work and involvement of the Almond Board and growers, the work you've been doing on efficiency recharge, and even just involvement in your local GSAs is instrumental to making this work. Just by chance, how many people out there are participating in their local groundwater sustainability agency or advisory committee or have gone to meetings? I really encourage you, even though plans have been in the critically overdrafted basins been submitted and the ones due to come in January or in the midst, continue to stay involved because it's just the beginning of the process. It's a 20-year process to implement. So I will just mention the drought. As Dave said, the drought has really put a lot of pressure on how SGMA is implemented. As you know, the state water project allocation came out last week with a zero allocation, initial allocation for the first time. And there's a lot of actions that are going to need to be taken if the hydrology stays the same. It looks like we might get a little wet weather, but I think things are staying pretty dry as they have probably for the last 20 years, and that's going to be a driver. And we've been trying to keep focused that SGMA is not a drought response tool. It's a long-term sustainability process, and so we have to deal with the drought like we do other natural disasters and protect people and property while we adapt our resiliency plans, including GSPs. And the driver on the last drought, I think, as most of you know, is the driver to bring California out of just on a statewide basis managing surface water, which began in 1914 through that act. And at the time, groundwater wasn't included in that amendment that led to water rights, control of surface water, and ultimately the state board. So it did take, ironically, 100 years to the year to pass SGMA, which was the first time the state had a regulatory structure for groundwater. And the importance of groundwater, because a large portion of our people, agriculture, environment relies on groundwater. Moreover, during droughts, as we've seen, because there's no surface water available, your trees need, in many cases, extra winter water because Mother Nature's not providing that. And then 85% of Californians rely on groundwater, so it's critically important. And as we've seen the drivers during the last drought with through monitoring data, historic lows of groundwater levels really increased. We were looking at trends, and these things were becoming more difficult, exacerbated by the drought, but there was groundwater management needed to be done throughout the state, including subsidence. I will point out, a couple weeks ago, we released what's called California Groundwater. It was also called Bulletin 118, which is a 5-year update summarizing California's groundwater conditions. It has good pullouts for regional basin information. But moreover, some of these tools that we have on groundwater levels, subsidence, well permitting, we recast the database so you can go in, it's user-friendly. and you can do different timescales, different areas to pull out different data sets, and even pull up specific data, whether it's from specific wells and everything. So I invite you all to go view that. So now switching to SGMA. You know, we had spent early times, and our role at DWR is to twofold. One, establish the rules of the road for creating your groundwater sustainability plans, and also reviewing those plans for compliance with SGMA. So we put regulations in place early on, and you know, plans, the 21 critically overdrafted basins got their plans in by January. And then we're waiting for the influx of the plans in January coming up, 2022. We're expecting 70 to 90 plans. So we're going from 46 to 70 to 90. So we're ready for that. And then we, again, have 2 years to evaluate those for compliance. And then every 5 years, plans will have to be kind of submitted in on a performance check on where things are going on projects and management actions, how are agencies going along their trends to reach their sustainability goals, and that's going to be another compliance review process. I do want to mention too, there was a lot of, I think, anxiety, and I will say before I came to DWR in June, I was in Butte County. I was working for the county on 3 subbasins and 3 plans, so I understand sort of the enormous complexity in pulling these together, and the anxiety that you want the plan to come in, you know, as solid as possible in the first submission. But what we do know, for a 20-year period, if you think about it, no plan's going to remain as it was when it's submitted. It's going to need to be adaptive, be updated as land use change, water supplies change, circumstances change. So we're just looking to make sure that it's compliant, and there's the means to adapt it over time. So, yeah, we're in the midst of early assessments of the basins. What we decided to do is to come out, even though our statutory deadline is January, to come out with the official assessments that would either say a plan is acceptable or incomplete. And incomplete plans are those major deficiencies that prevent us from approving. We give another 6 months for the agencies to correct those deficiencies. And if they're not able to do that, then we'll go into consultation with the state board. But we wanted to do also, because our main goal is compliance. We want to foster compliance. The main effort of this is, in SGMA is different because it's really geared to having local control on setting the management decisions rather than the state. So compliance is key, and that's why we wanted to get out early on evaluations to the GSAs on the major deficiencies we were seeing, to start that dialogue and get them on track to resolve those deficiencies so we can get them approval and keep the train on the track towards sustainability. So we've gone through that process right now, notifying the GSAs as to the status of their plans. You know, it is going to take a lot of changes. We recognize a lot of communities are going to be impacted through this transition, and that's why really looking at the 20-year time frame is going to be critically important. And again, to stay involved locally, because these decisions locally are going to only be made with your input and knowledge. So it's really going to be important. One of the things that we've also heard, and part of our effort to support local agencies, is data and tools to help inform decisions. So emerging water trading and water markets is something that some agencies are looking at to smooth out some of the shortages. We're looking at a water accounting system in an open ET format to help local agencies make better informed decisions. Use reduction is something that we know is going to happen in a lot of basins. We are looking at trying to provide support through local agencies, community development organizations, and others on the transition that locals may need, and see what support the state can afford. Local agencies, one big program that just got started, there was some workshops last week on multi-benefit land repurposing. A $50 million program was enacted in this past budget. It's a start to get some support out there and some grants regionally to help with the transition. So I think as we evolve and we see what's in these plans and what drivers local agencies are going to need to take to achieve sustainability, we want to balance that with trying to help local communities through the difficult transition. So recharge, and this is something really for the almond industry. I want to acknowledge the great work on really promoting groundwater recharge, flood mower projects, and even data acquisition through what we're calling AEM, airborne electromagnetic method, and some of them have used ground-based methods where they're basically mapping the geologic architecture, almost like an NMR for the Earth. So we, at the state, we got funding to do that throughout the entire state, and we have finished last week southern San Joaquin Valley down in Bakersfield. We're going to move up in the spring to the rest of the San Joaquin Valley and Sac Valley, and that will map out the entire state. So that'll be an important data set to help facilitate recharge, flood mower projects, monitoring data, and other things to help better understand basin conditions. We're also working with our partners at the state board to help facilitate and improve the process of recharge projects, which is going to be very important when we get the other side of the mountain of the severe drought and get, back to anticipating heavy wet years again. We're going to need to be ready to capture that water for basin conditions. And again, improving groundwater storage and basins is real important. We're going to be looking to support those efforts. The water resiliency portfolio the administration put in last year has a lot of elements on improving banking and recharge. Lastly, I just want to say on these projects, 20-year time frame seems like a long time. Plans are in their early stages for implementation, and there are going to be agencies that are going to have to work through deficiencies to get approved. But in all that, they've been implementing these plans, the ones that have been submitted for 2 years now, and ones that are getting submitted have a pretty good understanding where they want to go. And these projects and actions are going to need to be scoped out and worked on as soon as possible, because a lot of them take a lot of time. There's permitting involved, there's uncertainties, and fortunately there is also funding available right now. We're going to be coming out with $300 million over the next 3 years for GSAs to implement their plans. So the time is now to build that sustainable future. So thank you.
Now Scott Hamilton is going to be able to tell us about all the solutions we're going to have. And something I didn't get to mention about Scott earlier, and I recently learned, I didn't know, he has a PhD in ag economics. So all these years we should have been calling him Dr. Hamilton. So welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. How are we doing on time? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. It's really good to see so many people here interested in water. I suspect your concern is well justified. After you've just listened to the first two speakers, I don't have to tell you that in the San Joaquin Valley we have a serious water shortage problem. If it's not just SGMA, we have to deal with the San Joaquin River restoration. The state board is looking at increased flows on the San Joaquin tributaries to keep more water in the rivers. There's going to be inevitably more endangered species listings. And we've also got climate change that looks like it's going to impact the amount of water we can pump out of the delta from the limited amount we've got now. So the question is, what can we do? You have probably seen the signs around the valley that says, solve the water crisis now. How do we do that? Some of the other signs say, build more dam storage. I would suggest that you question that rather than just accept it. Reservoirs now in California, given our climate cycles, don't work really well. We have built the most effective reservoirs already. When we get a really wet cycle, the reservoirs fill up very quickly, and then for the rest of the wet cycle, that water's flowing out to the ocean. In the really drought, when we have a drought cycle, the reservoirs are empty after the first 2 years, and then they're no use for the next 3 years of the drought. The alternative would be to use the biggest natural water storage facility in California, which is the groundwater basin in California. It's essentially got an unlimited storage capacity and is well suited to getting us through both the wet cycles and the dry cycles. The trouble is we have to be able to find the water to store that. I think in a lot of the GSPs, there's been a lot of double counting of the available water supplies. There wasn't, and I think, obviously DWR has been paying close attention to that. So clearly there's a need to capture a lot more floodwater off of our east side streams that we're taking right now. But everybody's going to do that. We're not going to need help to do that, and there's going to be a lot of competition for that water. So I'm going to talk about Delta Smelt. But though if we do nothing, the problems are very significant. I'm getting a lot of echo here, sorry. So if we do nothing, we're looking at 1 million acres coming out of production, which to me makes no sense whatsoever. This is the most productive farmland in the world. If we do that, if we take 1 million acres out, we're going to lose 42,000 jobs in agriculture, 65,000 jobs in the valley, and $7 billion per year in revenues. $7 billion per year. That's what's at stake right now. These numbers come from a study from Dave Sunding, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. And it's not just, it's not just farmers that are going to get hurt. It's going to be the disadvantaged communities. It's going to be the towns. It's a very big problem for the valley. So we already talked about more groundwater storage and using more flood water. And I'll get back to the numbers here in a minute. But the general set of solutions that we're looking at here is some combination of more groundwater storage, land retirement, developing a big picture solution for the valley. And it's important to realize that we're not in this together, right? There are a lot of different entities that need water in the valley, including the disadvantaged communities and including the environment. So there's been a lot of collaboration so far trying to bring those parties together to work together. I don't know, you've probably seen it in the papers recently, but the environmentalists sent a letter to the governor saying that growing almonds should be declared a non-beneficial use of water. What? Right? This is the kind of problems that we're up against, right? The political problems are going to be enormous here. So we need to get as many people on our side as we can, and so there's a real need for this collaboration in the valley, and there are a lot of people that are working on it right now. I won't go into these numbers, but just very briefly, we have a 3 million acre feet problem in the valley, in the San Joaquin Valley, 3 million acre feet. About 2 million acre feet of that is due to, is on the agricultural side, and then the environment needs about another 1 million acre feet. There is a solution here, and I'll keep moving on this, but so 3 million acre feet. Some of that can be obtained by recycling some of the environmental water. We're going to capture all of the local stream water that's available in the local east side floodwater. The rest of the water really needs to come from the delta, and there is a lot of surplus water in the delta. This study is from the Public Policy Institute of California, and it shows the current uses of delta water right now, and those red bars on top is the amount of surplus water that flows out to the ocean. If you average that over the period here, it would average 10 million acre feet. Thank you, Sarah. Is that better? Thank you. It would average 10 million acre feet. So clearly there are drought cycles in there where there's no water available. But you have some wet cycles where there's a ton of water available. So we've got 10 million acre feet a year flowing out to the delta on average, right? if we could capture 2 million acre-feet of that, right, 20% of that, we could essentially solve most of the water problems in the valley. We can't capture that water right now because of my dear friends, the Delta Smelt and some other endangered species. When those really big delta flows come, this happened, wait on it. Get closer. Thank you, Jesse. Is that better? Thank you so much. All right. So, so we can't pump that water when it's available right now because of the restrictions on pumping to protect Delta Smelt and other endangered species. And it's really because the current diversion technologies are unsuited. We can't pump the water without hurting or killing the fish. But there's some new interesting technology. The photo on the right is from Turlock Irrigation District. We put in a subsurface diversion. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble here. We put in a subsurface diversion on the Tuolumne River. So this was essentially a series of buried perforated pipes covered with gravel. And so the idea here is that the water flows over the top, the fish stay in the water, and you take the water out of the bottom of the water column. It's that same kind of solution now that we're looking for the delta. This is a sort of a conceptual diagram of what it would look like. Those infiltration beds are where the buried pipes would be. They'd flow into collector channels, and the water would get pumped out at the end. This is a very different concept from what's going on right now for two reasons. First of all, there's no dead end. At the moment, when we pump the water, all the fish get pushed towards the pumps, and there's no way for them to escape. Here, they would just move back and forwards over the top of the infiltration gullies. And then secondly, the fish just stay buoyant in the water column. So we've had teams of consultants working on this for more than 8 years now. And so we've got some of the important parameters identified, but there's still a lot to do. Once we get the water out of the delta, there's a lot of water districts that have the capacity to take that additional water right now, but there's going to be new conveyance. I'm just losing it here. There's going to be new conveyance needed in the valley to move the high flow delta water out of the delta and to where it's needed in the valley. I'm going to just stop here in the interest of time. But I just would like to say that, so we've got this general concept that we capture the high flow water that's currently flowing out to the ocean through new fish screens that don't hurt the fish, and we use existing surplus capacity, because this is winter and springtime water, in the California Aqueduct and the Delta Mendota Canal, and then we build, to the extent we need to, we build new canals to bring that water into the valley. There it would go into groundwater storage, so that's available through the drought cycles or to meet the irrigation needs. This solution is not simple, it's not easy, and it's not cheap. But at the moment, it's the best one we've come up with, rather than taking out 1 million acres of production.
I think Scott might just be too tall for the microphone. We're going to let Jesse now talk about the almond board, their study and the work they've done on irrigation in almonds.
Well, you had great slides, the rest of them, so. So picking up where Scott left off is, once we get it out of the delta through new conveyance canals, if necessary, then we're going to have to put it back into the ground. And that's where the new guide that is being released today by the Almond Board, we've got copies in the back of the room. If we run out there, I've got a few extras with me, and then there are also some at our Almond Board booth. And also where you guys and women that are farmers come in, because actually this solution is in your hands. You're part of the solution. OnFarm Recharge is actually one of the most efficient ways to put water back into the ground because you're beside an existing conveyance canal, and we really need the size and scale and scope of almond orchards to do the type of recharge that's necessary, because the water comes in such large amounts and it's most easily applied to the aquifer if you spread it out over large areas of land. So that's why working lands are such a critical piece of this solution. And typically we've done it in recharge basins, but on-farm recharge is really a part of this solution, and it's one that farmers can participate in. So if this concept is new, or if you want to learn more, or if some of the acronyms that you might have heard today are new, that's where this guide comes in. It's really just a way to set the context and get started in this conversation. It's not going to give every answer, but at least so you can be an informed participant in the conversation. So take a look at this guide. It explains what groundwater recharge is. The research that we've done is the almond board that shows that applying excess water above ET in the dormant season is safe for your trees. And that when a GSA or a district says, we'd like to use your farm for recharge, that you could feel secure that it's going to be safe, at least in the dormant season. But then you've still got operations that you need to do during the winter time. Go out and prune, you might apply fungicides, you might do mummy shakes. So you're still going to have to ask yourself, is this a fit for my operation? What additional changes am I going to have to do in order to do recharge on farm? So that's why there are multiple recharge methods that are covered in this guide, and I'll talk about the 3 that are in here in just a minute. And then we've also got examples of growers that are doing this. There are people that are out there that have been practicing this and trying to develop the best practices. To begin with, I pose 4 questions to you as a grower. Do I have access to surface water for recharge? These are critical steps at deciding whether you're a good fit for doing groundwater recharge on your farm. Do I have surface water? And at what regularity? Do I have the right soil? Of course, sandy soils are a lot better for recharge, putting it through that Vados, subsurface zone, and getting it into the aquifer, where it counts for sigma. What methods are available? We've got on-farm, we've got subsurface, and then we've got recharge basins. And then what changes am I going to have to make in order to accommodate this excess water? So here are the 3 types covered in the guide. This first one, surface application to orchards. This one might be the one you're most familiar with. Don Cameron with CDFA has done this in his, on his farm down in the Magsa area. I've met a couple farmers that are a part of that district and a part of that project. Then we've got below the surface of agricultural fields. This is one that I've heard about as being used increasingly on the west side. The advantage to this is you don't have to make many changes, if any, to your farm, but you have to think ahead if you're installing an orchard or putting it back in after pulling it out. That's when you put in these subsurface tile drains below the root zone, specifically for the purpose of recharge. So you can take water at any time of the year that it's available. And then lastly, basins. Of course, we're all familiar with the large basins that have been used for decades by districts to do recharge. And a lot of them, we were talking last night, why would you forego having an orchard just to put in a recharge basin? Well, it turns out that required a lot of foresight, but some of those areas that did it now still have healthy groundwater levels. So, but here also, as we've talked about with land repurposing, there might be parts of your farm that are sandier than others. You might have heterogeneous soils, so you could take, if you've only got a limited supply of water that you can only water, if you collectively pull it together and you can fully irrigate a portion of your farm, you take the part out that's sandier, better for recharge, dedicate that for a recharge basin, and the state, through this multi-benefit land repurposing program, or SGMA, or a federal program with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, may help fund those types of projects. So just to wrap it up here, because I think people may have questions, and we've got a microphone up here, encourage you to come up and ask them, is what next? We're going to have at the Almond Board a grower practitioner network, so you can learn from other farmers that are practicing on-farm recharge. With our partners, Sustainable Conservation, that developed this guide with the Almond Board, they're working with the Department of Water Resources to develop case studies to learn from people from these practitioners about what those best practices are. The Natural Resources Conservation Service also has a pilot program where they're identifying GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, to pilot GSA-wide recharge programs. So again, reach out to me. Here's my contact information if you think that's something you might be interested in. And then lastly, with the Almond Board's outreach program, we've done a lot of work on reducing harvest dust, improving irrigation efficiency, reducing spray drift from pesticide applications, a whole range of different grower practices. Now we want to help growers do groundwater recharge, and we would be very interested if you're doing recharge in hosting a field day on your farm. So if any of those sound of interest, feel free to reach out to myself, and I'll help put that together. So with that, I just want to thank you for your interest in this. You're the farmers that feed the world. Humans are very creative, and I think I'm hopeful that we can get this solved, but we're going to have to work together.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you to everyone. We do want to take some time now for questions, and we'll take some questions from the audience. But I think, as farmers, we all are looking for solutions constantly of how to fix a problem. And I know that we all have seen or are participating in different, whether it's recharge or taking a portion of your orchard out of production for some of these recharge ponds, or simply just fallowing. A lot of that is already happening. And so, this group is here to talk about some of those projects that are occurring. But I encourage you, as Jesse said, to look in your GSA and to see what options are out there for you. Because these activities with respect to our groundwater storage, yes, they're being regulated, but ultimately they're to our benefit. If we improve our groundwater supply, it really helps us have that groundwater as a backup in times of drought, like right now, when we really have to rely heavily on that source. And if we don't do a good job as stewards of the land of replenishing that aquifer, it's only going to harm us. So I think most farmers I work with recognize that and really want to find solutions to this. So I encourage you to look and work with your GSAs on that. But we'd like to open it up to some questions. And I'm going to start with one to Paul, because, he's the regulator, so he gets the tough ones right off the bat. But Paul, being that DWR is the lead on this, but yet there's so many other agencies that have a role. For the farmer, they're not going to go to or they're hoping not to have to go to all these different agencies to deal with them. How is DWR working to coordinate with those various agencies to provide something back to the GSAs that they can work with?
Yeah, thank you. There's a number of state agencies and even federal agencies that have been involved with SGMA, either directly or indirectly. Biggest one, the State Water Resources Control Board, is our regulatory partner in this, and they have a unique role. It's a unique facet of the statute where if we have a inadequate plan, the state board can intervene after hearings and go through their process. But we've had a lot of good comments, input from state agencies, Department of Fish and Wildlife, some regional boards, some local agencies who manage levees, and State Water Resources Control Board. So all those agencies play a stakeholder process, giving input into those GSPs based upon their experience, their knowledge, their information. So I think for our view is really the rubber hits the road at the local agency. We're looking, they take those comments into account in their plans, but ultimately we're looking to have the plans be compliant, but the management decision and how the decisions are made to manage the basin is left at the local level. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, and just as a reminder, there's microphones here in the front on this side and that side of the aisle. So if you'd like to come up and ask a question, please do. I'm going to ask Scott, because he cut his slide short, if he could elaborate a little bit on the collaborative efforts that are underway that are critical to getting this done. It's not just an agricultural problem. It's a problem for all of California, and all parties have to participate in this.
Thanks, Sarah. So you may or may not know that the Friant division sort of took a leadership role pretty early on with SGMA, recognizing that if we're going to come up with a solution for the valley, it really needs to be a very broad-based solution. That everything we've done so far to date had essentially been at the district level or at the IRWIMP level, like the regional level. And if we're going to find a solution, it's going to be sort of interregional. It's going to have to be basin-wide. So they started what was called the blueprint effort and tried to make that effort very broad-based. But sort of a good colleague of mine, Tim Quinn, who'd heard a similar sort of presentation pre-COVID, recognized that we're probably not going to get that done just by ourselves, that we needed to generate a much broader base of support. And Tim, who used to work with Metropolitan and then with ACWA, the Association of California Water Agencies, drew on a fairly large network of his colleagues and put together a coalition of 60, I think it's 70 different entities now. Pretty soon, we came to realize that all of these different entities had the same problem. The environmentalists needed more water for migratory waterfowl and seasonal wetlands. Disadvantaged communities, like we have a host of disadvantaged communities in the valley that don't have an adequate water supply. And clearly, agriculture needed a lot more water. So all of these different entities from sort of very different backgrounds needed more water. And there was sort of a lack of understanding of what the real problem was. So we spent a lot of time just sort of understanding, and they were the slides I skipped over, what those real problems were. But essentially, we all sort of came to a realization that A, the problem was very big. B, we weren't going to solve the problem with the local water supplies. And we really all had sort of the same kind of problem. So where we're up to right now is there has been sort of agreement on a set of problem, like a problem statement, that where everybody appreciates what the other person's problem. The second thing is that they've generated a broad solution set. There's no details associated with that. There's no numbers associated with that. But it's a direction forward. So that sort of ended the phase one of that collaborative effort. In March of 2022, we're meant to head into phase two, where we actually start to put some meat on the bones of that. How do we actually get all of that done? How do we meet those environmental demands, and where should they be met? And how do we get water to the disadvantaged communities? And then how do we fulfill the blueprint plan of getting water to the farmers and preventing a lot of land coming out of production? So still a lot of work to do. 2022 is going to be pretty critical, but it's really encouraging to see such sort of a broad base of support because we do have a lot of environmentalists in that group that see that there is benefit to restoring habitat in the San Joaquin Valley rather than letting the water flow out to the ocean. So in that respect, they're very much aligned with a lot of the agricultural interests.
Thank you, Scott. And as a follow-up to that, I might lean on Dave to talk about how some of his clients might be incorporating some of those. I know that we're seeing many of these projects that incorporate some habitat into their recharge programs, and that provides this synergy between the entities that they're both searching the same thing. They want to capture these flows for one purpose of helping the habitat, for also helping the agriculture production in the future. So Dave, if you would talk a little bit about projects you're seeing out there.
Sure. First of all, we've worked with local agencies. I've worked with local agencies primarily on the Kings River system. Fresno Irrigation District was probably the leader of this, of developing district-level recharge that had some habitat benefits. But more recently, we've been involved in conversations with local stakeholders and growers on how we can create alternative, what we call multi-benefit alternatives to farming. And so we've got growers that are looking at properties that they've acquired, that they acquired for the water supply, right? They're transferring the water credit, surface water, and now potentially groundwater credit to other properties that they continue to want to farm. And so we've talked with them about how do we take that land and just, rather than have it be fallowed and you plow every 2 or 3 years to keep habitat off of it, how do we create habitat? And what kind of funding is required to do that? What kind of incentives do you, the grower, need? And so some of our larger clients have entertained that and explored those options, and I think some of those environmental entities that are involved in the coordinated planning process that Scott talked about are taking that kind of ground level conversation into those broader planning discussions. I think it's important for you all to get involved in those, to the extent that you anticipate or have some land that is necessarily going to have to be repurposed. I don't like that word, but it's the word. Let's start that dialogue about what incentives do you need to make that happen, because it is happening on a pretty limited scale with a few of our clients, but not as broadly as it needs to be.
Yeah, and as Paul mentioned earlier, there is a $50 million funding opportunity for these types of projects this year, and it's a good number, but it's nowhere near the number that will be necessary to deal with the ultimate SGMA impacts. And so the anticipation is, if we can show need for that $50 million right away, which I think there is need for that immediately, hopefully we grow that pot of money every year so that there are larger programs that can be financially supported through that fund.
Sarah, I might mention that, and Paul mentioned this earlier, that Department of Conservation had workshops last week. There are draft guidelines out for public comment soon, I think. There are two real significant issues with those regs today, or the framework of implementation. One is that a condition that all water supply attached to the land that's going to be converted is not usable anyplace else, and who's going to participate in a program if they can't move the groundwater and surface water credits to other properties. So we need to have some discussion about how to fix that. And then the other is, this puts the onus on Paul, is that the only eligible applicant is a GSA that's got an approved GSP. And we anticipate that there are not going to be a lot of initially approved GSPs in the areas that are going to be most sensitive for land repurposing. So we're working with DOC right now to try to provide some comment in and some more flexibility than the drafts provide.
Thank you, Dave. That's an excellent point that I hope Paul will help us work through as well. Sorry.
We'll get there.
And we do have a question. I'm excited. Go ahead. I can hear you, but I don't think your microphone is on.
Now you are.
Yep.
As an almond farmer, when I plant a tree or plant trees, I'm making a 20-25-year investment. And I appreciate all of you, and I'm very thankful for the information you've provided. And I understand you may not have what I really want to hear from you, but I'm not gaining much by what I've listened to. And I came specifically to this meeting to listen to you all, and the second water meeting a little later. There isn't enough information here for a farmer to decide whether on his land he should or she should plant almond trees with a 25-year investment. When can you give us that information? When will we get a little more specific and stop the generalities? And I understand you may not have the answers now, and I'm not accusing anybody of withholding information, but I'm looking for specifics, and thank you for providing those.
Well,
Thank you. That's a real good point. I think the this is very general because the design of the program was to have the local agencies make those determinations. So I think the specific place to go to make those decisions about investments is finding out what subbasin you're in, who the groundwater sustainability agency is. They've all pretty much have plans drafted, if not already adopted, and they've begun implementation. And they'll be able to tell you how the basin's going to be managed over the next 20 years to reach sustainability, and that'll give you the specificity in your local area. The one thing SGMA did not do was have the state determine what sustainability is locally, and that is left at the local groundwater sustainability agencies. Granted, it makes it a lot less consolidated, but I think having local control, local decision-making is the only way this is all going to work. Sure.
No, I would totally agree with what Paul just said. You absolutely have to understand what's going on at the GSA level. You have to understand what they're thinking about and what their plan is for managing the water over the next 20 years. So that's going to start off being fairly conservative because they will have probably a fairly conservative estimate of what additional water is going to be available. So when you come to plant an orchard, what that means is you've got to figure out that strategy for the next 20 years. So essentially, you know, if we're going from, you know, first of all, you have to find out whether or not they're allowing like water banking credits. Can you carry over, if you don't use all of your allocation in one year, can you carry it over to the next year? So for example, if you were thinking about planting 160 acres of almonds, you know, maybe you only plant 80 acres of almonds and you can, you carry over the credits. So for the first 10 years, you're building up a credit, and then the next 10 years, you're using that credit. That's going to depend a lot, GSA to GSA, on whether or not that kind of a strategy works. The other thing I would say is that if you need more water, you absolutely have to be in close touch with your GSA, because efforts like the Blueprint and the Collaborative Action Program that I'm talking about will not exist if we don't get more funding, right? And no one's got the incentive or the payment capacity. You know, it's going to be a major change here in the Valley as we move forward. So following up on what Paul said, stay in touch with your GSA and really understand the rules that they're implementing when you're making these long-term decisions.
Thank you. Dave, did you want to?
No. I agree with what they've said. This is GSA level conversation that needs to take place.
And it's really critical to all of you that you're engaged in your GSAs. I've seen it directly that the GSA put together a plan, and until the growers are in the room talking about what works for them, they are not implementing things until that happens. And so you really need to be in that room helping to craft that in your own GSA. So I really encourage that. And hopefully, I hope you all did get something out of this panel, because I think it was a great group of individuals that are highly dedicated to this groundwater problem and finding solutions for all of us. So thank you all for coming. I am required, I feel like I'm on some sort of game show or something, to read very specific closing comments. So if you'll bear with me, I will do that. But thank you for attending the Water Supply Challenges and Solutions for 2022 Outlook. The next set of presentations will begin at 10 a.m. Stockpile management is in room B3. How your trees work under adequate water supply and deficient supply is in room B4. Superpowering almonds global future is in room B7, and getting the skinny on ABC skin health research is in room B10. And before the next session begins, feel free to grab a cup of coffee. AC Horn is the brief function on ballroom B. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks for coming, everybody. Have a good almond conference.
Yeah.